Elias woke to the familiar cold that seeped through the floorboards of his cabin. It was a deep cold, one that lived in the bones of the old wood and, he often thought, in the bones of the man who lived there too. He swung his legs over the side of the narrow cot, the rough wool of his blanket scratching against his skin. He did not shiver. He had not truly felt the cold, or the heat, or much of anything for a long time. His life was a series of motions, a well-worn path from bed to field, from field to table, and back to bed again. He pulled on his worn leather boots, not bothering with socks. The calluses on his feet were thick enough to ward off the splinters and the chill. He moved to the small iron stove, his movements economical and silent. There was a rhythm to his morning, a liturgy of solitude. Scrape the old ashes, lay the kindling, strike the flint. The spark that caught was a small, defiant life in the gray dimness of the cabin. He fed it larger pieces of wood until a steady warmth began to push back against the gloom. On a small, uneven shelf above the stove sat a wooden horse. It was no bigger than his palm, its paint faded to pale suggestions of what it once was. Its legs were worn smooth, its ears chipped. He had carved it himself, years ago, for hands much smaller than his own. He ran a thumb over its back, a ritual as ingrained as lighting the fire. The wood held no warmth, it was just a thing, a marker of a life that was no longer his. He turned away from it and filled a kettle with water from the bucket by the door. The farm was owned by Martha, a woman whose kindness was as sturdy and unadorned as her fences. She left him to his work and his silence, for which he was grateful. He managed the lower fields, the barn, and the small herd of goats that provided milk and cheese. It was hard work, physical work, the kind that left a man too tired to think. That was the point. Thinking was a barren field where nothing good grew. He ate his breakfast standing by the stove, a thick slice of yesterday's bread, hard and tasteless. He chewed and swallowed, his gaze fixed on the single window that looked out over the frost-covered pasture. The world outside was as quiet as the world within his walls. The sun was a pale smear on the horizon, promising a day like all the others, predictable, empty, safe. He had built this life carefully, wall by wall, routine by routine. It was a fortress against memory. He did not speak of what came before. The people in the small settlement at the foot of the valley knew he was a widower, that he had lost a child. They knew it in the way people in small places know things, through whispers and assumptions and the stark evidence of a man living alone when he should not be. They respected his silence, mistaking it for strength. It was not strength. It was the careful preservation of a wound, keeping it packed in ice so it would not ache. He finished his bread, rinsed his tin cup, and pulled his heavy coat from a peg by the door. The leather was stiff, smelling of rain and goat and cold earth. He stepped outside, the sharp air hitting his face. The sun was beginning to burn through the morning mist, turning the frost to glittering diamonds on the blades of grass. It was beautiful, he supposed. He just could not feel it. He latched the cabin door and walked toward the barn, his boots leaving dark prints on the frozen ground. His work was waiting. It was always waiting. The child had arrived 3 weeks prior. A small group of traders had found her wandering near the wreckage of a merchant wagon on the high pass. Orcs. The traders had debated leaving her, but one of them had a conscience. They had brought her to the settlement, a small, gray-skinned thing with wide, terrified eyes and tusks no bigger than grains of rice. She was wrapped in a scorched blanket and had not made a sound. The community, led by Martha, had done its duty. They had fed her, given her a place to sleep in a corner of the main farmhouse. But they did not know what to do with her. She was an orc, a wild thing, people whispered. Unpredictable. She refused to let anyone near her, flinching from every offered hand. She ate only when the food was left on the floor and the person retreated to the other side of the room. And she remained utterly silent. The trauma of the attack had stolen her voice. Elias had kept his distance. It was not his concern. He had his fields, his goats, his walls. A child, especially a broken one, was a danger to his carefully constructed peace. He saw her sometimes, a small shadow in the yard, always watching, always alone. He looked away each time, a familiar tightness in his chest. Then one morning, she was in his barn. He had gone to fetch a milking pail before dawn, and found her huddled in the hayloft, tucked behind a stack of old bales. She was shivering, her thin clothes no match for the encroaching autumn. She looked at him with those huge dark eyes, not with fear, but with a kind of desperate stillness, as if hoping that by not moving, she might become invisible. He stood there for a long moment, the pail handle cold in his hand. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to walk away, to leave the child for Martha to find. She was not his responsibility. He had renounced that responsibility long ago. He could not, would not, open that door again. But the sight of her, so small and alone in the vast, cold space of his barn, chipped away at the ice around his heart. He saw not an orc, but the universal shape of a child trying to make herself small in a world that was too big and too cruel. He saw the tremor in her hands, the way she tucked her chin to her chest. He let out a slow breath, the sound loud in the quiet barn. He did not move closer. He did not speak. Instead, he turned and walked back out, leaving the barn door slightly ajar. He went to his cabin, his mind a turmoil of resistance and a strange, unwelcome pull of compassion. He took an old, thick horse blanket from the chest at the foot of his bed. It smelled of dust and disuse. He returned to the barn and placed the blanket on the floor, a good 10 feet from the hayloft ladder. Then he turned and went about his morning chores, his movements a little stiffer, a little less certain than before. He milked the goats, his hands working automatically, while his mind kept straying to the small shape in the hay. He did not look up. He did not check to see if she had taken the blanket. He simply worked, pretending she was not there. When he finished, the sun was fully up. He walked out of the barn without looking back, but from the corner of his eye, he saw that the blanket was gone. That was the beginning. She did not leave the barn. It became her space. Martha, upon finding out, had simply nodded. She feels safer there, I suppose. Safer with you. Elias had grunted in response, not wanting to acknowledge the truth in her words. Safety was a currency he no longer traded in. He established a new routine. In the morning, he would leave a small bowl of porridge and a cup of goat's milk on the same spot where he had left the blanket. He would go about his work, and when he returned an hour later, the bowl and cup would be empty. He never saw her eat. He never tried to. It was a silent transaction, an offering made and accepted without witness. For the first week, he only caught glimpses of her, a flash of gray skin as she darted from the barn to the edge of the woods. The impression of a small body in the hay. She was a ghost in his periphery. He continued to ignore her, to give her the space she seemed to crave. He knew what it was to want to be invisible. Then she began to watch him. He would be mending a fence post, and he would feel her eyes on him. He would look up and see her, sitting at the top of the hayloft doors, her small legs dangling, her expression unreadable. She was a tiny gargoyle perched above his world. He did not wave. He did not smile. He simply met her gaze for a second, then returned to his work. It was an acknowledgement. You are there. I am here. That was all. One afternoon, he sat on a stump to eat his lunch, a hunk of bread and a piece of hard cheese. He was aware of her watching him from the barn. He unwrapped his food, the wax paper crinkling loudly in the still air. He broke off a small piece of cheese and, without looking up, placed it on the stump beside him. He ate his own meal slowly, his focus on the grain of the wood under his hand, on the distant call of a crow. He sat for a long time after he finished eating. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind rustling the dry leaves. He did not move. He waited. He was not sure what he was waiting for. Finally, he stood up, brushed the crumbs from his trousers, and walked back to the fields. When he glanced back at the stump from a distance, the cheese was gone. A week later, she came down from the hayloft while he was in the barn cleaning the goat pens. She did not come close. She sat on an overturned bucket near the far wall, her hands clasped around her knees. She just sat there, watching him work. The air was thick with a shared, uncomfortable silence. He was intensely aware of her presence. Every scrape of his shovel, every grunt of effort seemed amplified. He did not speak to her. He did not look at her. He finished his work, his shoulders tight with the effort of appearing unaffected. He cleaned his tools, hung the shovel on its peg, and walked out of the barn. He felt as though he had passed some unspoken test. The next day she was there again, on the same bucket. And the day after that. It became part of their rhythm. He would work in the barn, and she would sit and watch. Her silence was a physical thing, a presence in the room as real as the smell of hay and animal. He found, to his surprise, that it was not an unwelcome presence. It was a silence that matched his own. They were two quiet islands in the same sea. The seasons began to turn. The vibrant greens of summer faded into the golds and russets of autumn. The air grew crisp and the days grew shorter. The child, Ursa, he had learned her name from Martha, remained. Her presence had woven itself into the fabric of his days. He no longer felt the tension when she was near. Her quiet observation had become a form of companionship. He started leaving small things for her to find. An apple, polished until it shone. A brightly colored feather from a blue jay. He never handed them to her. He would simply leave them on the bucket where she sat, and they would be gone when he returned. He was teaching her, he realized, that his presence did not mean danger. It meant a warm blanket, a bowl of porridge, a small, unexpected gift. One afternoon, he found her standing by the vegetable garden, looking at the weeds that were beginning to choke the last of the carrot tops. He walked over, picked up a small hand trowel, and began to work, methodically pulling the weeds and tossing them into a pile. He worked for several minutes, aware of her standing just a few feet away. He found a second, smaller trowel in the tool shed. It was old and a little rusty, but the handle was smooth. He went back to the garden and laid the tool on the ground between them. He did not say a word. He just went back to his own patch of earth and continued to work. He heard a soft scraping sound. He glanced over. She had picked up the trowel. She was clumsy at first, digging too deep or pulling up a carrot by mistake. But she watched him. She mimicked his movements, her small face set in a mask of intense concentration. They worked side by side, the only sounds the scrape of metal and dirt and the soft thud of discarded weeds. It was the first time they had truly worked together, a partnership of silence. When they finished, the carrot patch was neat and tidy. He gathered the weeds and she stood watching, the small trowel still clutched in her hand. He nodded at her, a single small dip of his chin. He thought he saw the corner of her mouth twitch, but it was gone before he could be sure. Their shared labor became a new routine. She would follow him as he worked, and he would find small tasks for her. She carried buckets of water that were not too heavy. She scattered feed for the chickens. She helped him brush the goats, her small hands surprisingly gentle. She was a quick learner, her eyes missing nothing. Her silence was no longer empty, it was attentive. Section. He learned the contours of her silence, the different shades of it. There was the watchful silence when she was learning a new task, the peaceful silence when she sat beside him as he repaired a tool, and the dark, heavy silence that fell upon her sometimes without warning, when a loud noise or a sudden movement would make her freeze, her eyes going distant and cloudy with a memory he could not see. On those days, he would not press her. He would simply continue his own work, his steady, quiet presence a bulwark against the storm inside her. He was an anchor, and he was beginning to realize that she was becoming one for him too. Her presence pulled him out of the gray fog of his own past, forcing him to be present, to be aware. One evening, he sat on the porch of his cabin, carving a piece of scrap wood. It was a habit from long ago, something his hands remembered even when his mind tried to forget. He was carving a bird, a simple swallow with outstretched wings. Ursa sat on the steps below him, watching the knife peel away thin curls of wood. He became lost in the work, in the familiar feel of the blade shaping the wood. He carved the delicate curve of the wing, the small head, the forked tail. And then he remembered who he had learned to carve for. He remembered a small, laughing face, a tiny hand reaching for the finished toy. His own hand faltered. The knife slipped, slicing a shallow cut into his thumb. He hissed, dropping the knife and the half-finished bird. He stared at the welling drop of blood, but he was not seeing it. He was seeing a different time, a different life. A wave of grief, sharp and sudden as a winter storm, washed over him. His breath caught in his chest. His shoulders slumped. He felt a small touch on his knee. He looked down. Ursa was looking up at him, her dark eyes wide with concern. She did not speak, but her expression was clear. She saw his pain. She was not afraid of it. She simply acknowledged it. She reached out a tentative finger and gently touched the back of his hand, just below the cut. It was the first time she had ever touched him voluntarily. The contact was brief, a fleeting warmth against his skin, but it broke the spell of his memory. He took a shaky breath. He looked from her face to the fallen bird on the porch floor. He did not pick it up. He left it there, a testament to a grief that had been witnessed. He simply sat there with the small, silent child until the sky turned dark and the stars came out. The pain in his chest had eased, replaced by something new, something fragile and unfamiliar. The next morning, the wooden bird was gone from the porch. He did not ask where it went. He did not need to. He knew she had taken it. A few days later, he found a small, perfectly smooth gray stone on his doorstep. It was cool to the touch, and it fit perfectly in the palm of his hand. It was an answer, a gift for a gift. He closed his fingers around it, the solid weight of it a comfort. He slipped it into his pocket. He carried it with him every day after that. It was a reminder that communication did not always require a voice. Trust, he was learning, was built in silence, through small acts of shared work and quiet understanding. The first snow of winter dusted the fields in white. Ursa now spent most of her days with him, retreating to the barn only to sleep. He had laid down a thick mattress of fresh straw for her and added 2 more blankets. He worried about her in the cold, but he did not know how to invite her into his cabin. The cabin was his last fortress, the place where his memories of his daughter, of his wife, were strongest. To bring another child into that space felt like a betrayal. So they continued their silent dance. They worked together in the cold, their breath pluming in the air. He taught her how to bank the fire in the workshop stove, how to check the goats for signs of sickness. She, in turn, showed him things he had stopped noticing. The intricate patterns of frost on a window pane, the V-shape of geese flying south. She would point, a small gray finger, and he would look, and for a moment, he would see the world through her eyes, a place of quiet wonder instead of muted pain. One afternoon, a man on a fine-looking horse rode up to the farm. He was dressed in the clothes of a town official, his face stern and pinched. Elias recognized him as Barden, a member of the town council, a man known for his rigid adherence to rules and his suspicion of outsiders. Martha met him in the yard, her arms crossed over her chest. Elias continued splitting firewood nearby, his movements slow and deliberate, but his ears were open. Ursa, who had been gathering kindling, froze at the sight of the stranger and retreated to the shadows of the woodshed, peeking out from behind the door. "Martha," Barden said, his voice carrying on the cold air, "I'm here about the orc." "Her name is Ursa," Martha said, her tone clipped. "Be that as it may," Barden sniffed. "The council has had complaints. People are concerned. It is not natural, having one of them living among us. It sets a bad precedent, and she is a burden on community resources." "She is a child who lost her family," Martha retorted. "She eats what we grow here. She is no burden." "That is not for you to decide," Barden said, his voice hardening. "She is an orphan of the state. There are procedures. She needs to be sent to the state orphanage in the capital. It's the proper, legal thing to do." Elias's axe stopped mid-swing. The orphanage, he knew of it. A grim, overcrowded place where children were forgotten, where the weak were preyed upon by the strong. It was no place for any child, let alone a small silent one, who had already seen the worst of the world. A cold dread, colder than any winter morning, settled in his stomach. "You will do no such thing," Martha said, her voice low and fierce. "I will," Barden insisted. "It is the law. I have the paperwork being drawn up. I am giving you a week's notice, out of respect for your standing in this community, but in 1 week I will return with the constable, and we will be taking the child." He did not wait for a reply. He wheeled his horse around and trotted away, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Martha stood rigid for a long moment, then her shoulders slumped. She looked over at Elias, her face etched with worry. Elias met her gaze, then looked toward the woodshed. A pair of wide, frightened eyes stared back at him from the shadows. The week passed under a cloud of unspoken tension. Elias worked with a grim determination, the rhythm of his labor a frantic prayer against the coming storm. Ursa stayed closer to him than ever before. She seemed to understand the threat that hung over them. She would often reach out and touch his sleeve, a small, grounding gesture, as if to reassure herself that he was still there. He could not bring himself to look at her for long. In her wide, trusting eyes, he saw an accusation. He had let her in. He had made her feel safe. And now he was going to let this man, this Barden, take her away. The thought was a shard of glass in his gut. He had failed one child. He could not bear to fail another. But what could he do? He was a farmhand. Barden was the law. He found himself unable to sleep. He would lie on his cot, staring into the darkness, the smooth gray stone from Ursa clutched in his hand. He thought about running, about taking her and disappearing into the mountains. But that was no life for a child. He thought about fighting, but that would only bring more trouble down on Martha, on them all. He felt trapped. His silence and solitude no longer a fortress, but a cage of his own making. On the final morning, the air was still and bitterly cold. A heavy gray sky promised more snow. Elias went about his chores, his movements mechanical. Ursa was at his side, a small, silent shadow. She did not leave him for a second. She held on to the hem of his coat, her knuckles white. Just after sunrise, they appeared at the end of the lane. Barden on his horse, and beside him, the town constable, a lanky, weary-looking man named Cole. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He stopped his work, planting his feet firmly in the muddy yard. He felt Ursa press against his leg, her small body trembling. He put a hand on her head, a gesture of protection he did not know he was capable of. Barden dismounted, a roll of parchment in his hand. Cole remained on his horse, his expression unreadable. "Elias," Barden said, his tone one of false sympathy. "Let's not make this difficult. It is for the best. She will be cared for by the proper authorities." Elias did not speak. He just stood there, a solid, unmoving wall between the men and the child. He could feel Ursa's fear, a living thing against his leg. He could smell the clean, cold scent of the coming snow. He could hear the frantic beat of his own heart. "She is not your concern," Barden continued, taking a step forward. "She is not your family. She is not your—" He was cut off by a small, clear voice. "Papa." The word hung in the frozen air, impossibly loud. It was the first word she had spoken in all the months he had known her. It was the first sound he had ever heard her make. It was rusty from disuse, but it was clear, defiant, an anchor thrown in a stormy sea. Elias froze. The word struck him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. It pierced through the years of ice and grief, straight into the wounded heart of him. It was a name he had not heard in a lifetime. It was a name he never thought he would hear again. Pain and a fierce, impossible joy warred within him. Barden stopped, his mouth slightly agape. Cole, the constable, shifted in his saddle, his gaze flicking from Ursa to Elias. Ursa, her small hand still gripping his coat, took a tiny step forward. She looked directly at Barden, her chin held high. "Papa," she said again, louder this time. The word was a claim, a declaration. From the farmhouse door, Martha's voice rang out, clear and strong. "You heard the girl, Barden. She has a father." She walked out onto the porch, a heavy iron skillet in her hand, as if she had been prepared to use it. Barden sputtered, his face turning red. "This is absurd. She's an orc. He's not. You can't just—" Elias looked down at the small girl clinging to his leg. He saw the trust in her eyes, the desperate hope. And in that moment, the walls he had so carefully built around his heart crumbled to dust. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an inevitability. He had been walking toward this moment since the day he found her in his barn. He rested his hand fully on her head, his fingers sinking into her thick, dark hair. He looked up, meeting Barden's furious gaze. His own voice, when it came, was rough but steady. "She stays." It was all he said. 2 words, but they held the weight of a vow. Cole the constable finally spoke, his voice quiet. "My authority, Mr. Barden, is for the collection of state orphans. This child, she does not appear to be one." He looked at Elias, and for the first time, Elias saw not a lawman, but a neighbor, a man who understood grief. "I see a girl with her father." Barden stared, his face a mask of thwarted authority. He had lost. The law, which he had tried to wield as a weapon, had been turned against him by a single word from a silent child. He crumpled the parchment in his fist. "This isn't over," he snarled, but the threat was empty. He mounted his horse, yanked on the reins, and galloped away, his anger a visible cloud around him. Cole lingered for a moment. He gave Elias a slow, deliberate nod. Then he too turned his horse and rode away, leaving them in the sudden, ringing silence. Elias stood there, his hand still on Ursa's head. He was shaking. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He looked down at her. She looked up at him, her dark eyes shining. She had saved them both. He finally bent down, his knees cracking in protest. He scooped her up. She was lighter than he expected, a small, solid weight in his arms. She wrapped her skinny arms around his neck and buried her face in his shoulder. He held her tight, his eyes closed against the sudden sting of tears. He could feel her small heart beating against his chest. It felt like his own was starting again after a long, cold winter. He carried her not to the barn, but to the front door of his cabin. He paused on the threshold, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was the line he had never crossed. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air in the cabin was cool and smelled of wood smoke and solitude. He walked over to the narrow cot and gently set her down. She looked around the small room, her eyes taking in the simple furnishings, the neatly stacked firewood, the single tin cup by the water bucket. Her gaze fell on the small shelf above the stove. On the shelf sat the worn, faded wooden horse. Elias followed her gaze. His heart seized. That horse was the last piece of his old life, a sacred relic he had never been able to put away. It belonged to a ghost, to a memory. He walked to the shelf and picked it up. The wood was familiar in his palm. He stood there for a long time, turning it over and over. He thought of the hands that had last held it. He thought of the laughter that used to fill this silent room. The grief was still there, a dull, permanent ache, but it was not all that was there anymore. He turned back to Ursa. He walked to the cot and knelt before her. He held out the wooden horse. His hand trembled. She looked at the horse, then up at his face. She did not take it immediately. She reached out a small hand and gently touched the tear that was tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. Then, carefully, she took the horse from him, her small fingers closing around it. He had given her the last piece of his past, and in doing so, he had finally opened the door to a future. That night, for the first time in years, the cabin was not empty. He made a small, soft bed for her on the floor near the stove, using his own spare blanket. He cooked a real meal, a thick stew with potatoes and carrots, and they ate together at the small table, the silence between them comfortable and warm. It was no longer a silence of trauma and grief, but one of peace. The next day, they began to build their new life. It was a life of quiet routines, much like the old one, but everything was different. He found himself talking to her, his voice rusty at first. He told her the names of the tools, the different types of clouds, the way to tell if a goat was happy. She rarely spoke back, but she listened to everything, her head cocked to one side. Her one word had been enough. It had been everything. He started to see the world in color again. He noticed the deep blue of the winter sky, the bright red of the winter berries growing by the fence. He heard the music in the wind whistling around the eaves of the cabin. He even found himself humming sometimes, an old, forgotten tune. Section. Martha would watch them from her kitchen window, a soft smile on her face. The rest of the community, having heard the story from Cole, left them in peace. They saw what the constable had seen, not a farmhand and an orc child, but a father and a daughter. One evening, months later, as spring was beginning to breathe life back into the frozen earth, he sat with her on the porch steps. He was carving again, a new figure. This time it was a small, tusked girl with a determined look on her face. Ursa leaned against him, watching the wood take shape. She pointed to the carving, then touched her own chest. He nodded, a real smile spreading across his face. "Yes," he said, his voice soft, "that's you." She looked up at him, her dark eyes luminous in the twilight. She didn't say anything, she didn't need to. She simply leaned her head against his shoulder, the small wooden horse clutched in her hand. Elias looked out over the fields, green with the promise of new growth. He had thought his life was over, a story that had ended in tragedy. He had been wrong. It was just a long, quiet chapter. A family was not something made of blood or law. It was made of quiet moments, of shared work, of a blanket offered in a cold barn. It was forged in the stubborn, silent refusal to let someone be alone in the dark.